My name is Kevin Coop. I'm the content guy from morningnewsbeat.com. I'm happy to welcome you to this morning's first session. First thing I want to do is thank our sponsors. The session sponsor is Bard Valley Natural Delights, and our AV sponsor is Origin O. So thank you to them for making today possible. Give them a round of applause. We want them to feel like their money has been well spent. So our first session this morning is called Deep Dive, Organic Sales Analysis and the Why Behind the Buy. And I think it's going to be really, really interesting. We have two panelists, and the way this morning is going to work is each of them is going to make about a 10-minute presentation, give you a little sense of different sides of that question, different answers to that question. And then what we're going to have is a conversation. And when I say conversation, that doesn't mean I'm going to sit here and I'm just going to ask them questions. I'm going to do that. But it's also up to you to ask questions as well. This is your conversation. So I have a microphone. So if you have a question, and I may work my way out there at some point, if you have a question, raise your hand, shout out just in case I don't see you. I will get a microphone to you, and you can get involved in the conversation. Okay? So all very casual, informal, and hopefully informative by the time the 50 minutes is up. So let me introduce, first of all, our panelists this morning. We have Jordan Rost. Is it Rost or Rost?
Nailed it, Rost.
Rost, there you go. I had a Lazopoulos recently, and I totally screwed that up. So I was happy to have easy ones today. He is the Vice President of Consumer Insight with Nielsen. And then we have Melissa Abbott, who's the Vice President of Hartman Retainer Services. So they will be presenting to us this morning. And Jordan, you're up first.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for being here this morning. I'll stand up just to get some energy in here. So I'm going to start today. We're going to talk about the why. I'm going to do a lot of what discussion. So we'll share a lot of data around what's happening in the marketplace, where do we see things going, and where I want to, I guess we should have flashed up some of these sponsors. I'm going to talk a little bit about this large battle for clean eating that we're seeing play out. And obviously, I'll root that in what we're seeing within organic produce. But I'll give you a sense of the larger landscape as well. At Nielsen, we look across the entire retail landscape, look at all the food and all the consumer products that people are buying. There's a lot of commonalities that weave between all those. So I'm going to give you that broad macro view, and then we can build on top of that as we go through the rest of this session. So I'm going to start with a bunch of data. This is looking at sales growth, or in some ways the lack thereof, over the last few years across consumer goods as a whole. The tall bars are dollars, so people are spending more money on all the products that they bring into their homes. I think that's a good thing for all of us. The way they're doing that is changing. So people are buying larger pack sizes, they're buying more stuff, and they're also buying it in channels other than the ones that we're looking at here. So this is really looking at stores and the physical retail environment. So as more and more people are buying online, I know there'll be sessions later today that cover some of those dynamics. That is impacting how they're shopping and shopping for all of your products. I'm probably not breaking any new news there. But obviously, this has been, when we look out across all the retail environment, we look out across consumer packaged goods as a whole, it's been a challenging few years. And that flat growth, we're finally seeing some optimism, I think, in the last year or so. And we'll unpack some of where that's really playing out. Diving into food and fresh food in particular, ton of upside still. So when we talk to our retailing clients, we talk to our manufacturing clients, everyone is still heavily focused on fresh foods, perishable foods, the deli counter as a way to bring people back in store to combat against the rise of online grocery and online food. That's not going to change anytime soon. Just to give you a sense of context, when we talk about fresh perishables here, 14 times the total size of consumer goods online. So yes, Amazon and the future of online retailing, that's the future. Today, every conversation we have is very much about how do we maximize and leverage the growth opportunities within fresh perishables. But by scale, obviously it's quite a bit smaller than when we talk about center store edibles, and they're both contributing roughly the same amount to growth. So a ton of growth potential, very much still there. But we've seen kind of this push back towards a much more inclusive view of healthier eating. And that's really where I want to anchor the first part of today's conversation is, as much as there has been a push towards fresh foods and certainly towards organic foods, we are seeing that growth dynamic spread a bit more across the entire landscape. We're seeing growth for the first time within frozen departments. We're seeing growth within packaged foods. Really, I think taking some of the appeals that organics and that fresh foods had and remixing them a little bit and bringing them back into the rest of what people are buying, which I think creates some competitive dynamics for the things that you are all thinking about. But I think there's also potential synergies which we can lay out. I think it's worth mentioning, obviously, this is growth across the entire landscape. Everyone's seeing a bit of growth. It's worth noting that produce is not seeing as much of the upside that it used to see. And in fact, from a consumption standpoint, so the stats we have here about dollars, when we look at actual unit consumption, which is really, I think, a better barometer of consumer behavior, only the areas in green are actually seeing more consumers come home with more products. So there's really a strong shift dynamic happening even within produce, where people are shopping very differently for produce than they used to even just a few years ago. And all of the benefits of produce, healthier eating, cleaner eating, very much aligned with organics, there's a little bit more of a democratization of that appeal, and shoppers are able to find those types of appeals in a wider array of products. They're also able to see it across a wider array of retail outlets. So when we look at where the share of organic spend across food has gone to, we're not seeing as much of that strong concentration in the premier fresh grocers of the world, Whole Foods and many other that fall underneath that banner. We're seeing it become much more accessible across a wider array of retail channels. And I think for some that's a good thing, because more shoppers, a wider diversity of shoppers means more opportunity, creates challenges in terms of the different retail collaboration opportunities and client partnerships you have to build to enable this. So I think in some ways, I don't want to call this a dilution of what organics means to consumers. It certainly is a broadening of what that definition means. And obviously, I think this is a double-edged sword in the sense that more consumers are getting access to these products. But it does come with a bit of a dilution of what that value means to shoppers at the end of the day. And when shoppers think about their choices of clean, natural, simple, raw, whatever appeal you want to layer onto the food, there's a wider array of choice that shoppers have today. I think it really used to be, you've got conventional and then you've got your naturals and organics, and we're seeing a longer tail emerge of different paths towards this same type of idea of cleaner eating. Could be actual clean, where the product doesn't include a whole set of ingredients that shoppers want to avoid. It could be sustainable, which is a much more macro view of what healthier, cleaner food can mean. But there's an increasing long tail of different paths towards clean eating that I think give shoppers a more holistic way to live a more natural, organic, whatever wholesale lifestyle. But it does create different challenges in terms of the different points of competition that many of you are facing when thinking about winning that shopper at the shelf. When we look at what shoppers actually say that they trust, we're seeing a different dynamic emerge as well. And I would characterize a broad shift away from claims that simply state something to a more specific actual delivery of an attribute or of a specific, in many cases, ingredient focus about what's in or what's not in a product, and a much bigger shift from actual attribute to benefit. And this is very much aligned with functional foods. Food is medicine. What are these foods actually doing for me? And what is the specific makeup of that food, the supply chain dynamics that got that food onto shelf in front of me? All of these things and that focus on transparency has never been more important. And I do think we are seeing a bit of a dilution of broad kind of umbrella ideas like organic and like natural that I think is adding up to some of the trust gap dynamics that I think we're starting to see here. This is not to say that, organic is underperforming the total market. That is not the case at all. Organics, naturals, pretty much all these dynamics are outperforming the conventional versions of these products. But I think what you are seeing is a broadening and in many cases fragmenting landscape of what it means to be healthy when it comes to food. And shoppers have more choice than ever. They have the ability to navigate that choice better than ever. And the ways that they're doing it is also changing, which we'll talk about in a bit. And I think we are seeing this dynamic where, in many cases, the perimeter of the store, the produce section, in many cases the deli counter, those fresh food areas really were the early beneficiaries of this push towards what I'll roll up and say transparency. All these different appeals, be it clean, be it organic, be it natural, really was endemically, within all the areas that you all think about. We're seeing a bit of a balance back towards packaged food actually being able to authentically play in that space. Small, authentic, niche, local brands who sell packaged food are able to still leverage, I think, many of the appeals that you've all benefited from, but do that in a way that lives within different parts of the store and lives within a very different part of the market. And that's true in the frozen section, that's true in the packaged food section as well. So we're seeing, I think, a leveling of the playing field of who can authentically play in the organic space. And that's exciting, that's challenging. Again, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And this focus on ingredients is basically taking items and appeals that I think used to endemically live within your world and spreading that across the entire retail category sector landscape. Something like cauliflower has obviously been in a tremendous trend that works as a commodity that's a fresh piece of produce, but then also becomes an ingredient that rises other boats with rising tides. Areas in the frozen aisle are actually benefiting from the shift towards cauliflower as a grain alternative. And so things that start endemically within your world are making their way into other categories, into other brands, into other parts of the retail ecosystem, which I think can create tremendous opportunity as you're thinking about partnerships or co-merchandising across all these different appeals. And I think what we're seeing as part of this is an interesting dynamic where in many cases things that once were commodities are now very much becoming branded. And so in the case of cauliflower, and very much in the case of cauliflower rice, a lot of the growth that we're seeing in these appeals come not from commodity or even private label, but really from branded appeals and branded products and branded offerings. And so this dynamic and breakdown between this, I would say, kind of generic perimeter of the store and the branded center of the store completely blurring. And we're seeing this, I think, real strong investment in many of the brands that you all represent and really treating them as brands the same as the large packaged food brands that have existed for many decades. And there's a ton of opportunity there to really tell that authentic story and use the power of brand to connect that with consumers. I mentioned that, this is true for brands. It is also true for private labels as well. So across the entire food landscape, very much concentrated obviously within produce as well. And even within organic produce, there's been this incredible, shift of power from what we'll call national brands to private labels. And retailers are really upping their game in terms of the appeals of being natural, being organic, everything that I mentioned about transparency. Many retailers are really heavily investing in establishing their private labels as a way to get those same attributes and benefits and types of food, but maybe do it a little bit smarter and a little bit more of a value offering. And so consumers are really resonating, these appeals are resonating with consumers, and we're seeing this really dramatic balance of power shift between growth being really concentrated in national brands, which is the purple bar here, and private labels, which is the blue bar, in just a few short years. So the rate of change of seeing these dynamics is pretty staggering. And we're seeing it really across the landscape. It's true for packaged food, it's true for fresh foods, everything from nuts to coffee to soup really is, the types of things that shoppers are becoming more amenable to trying at least within a private label. And now this is not every retailer that's benefiting from this. I think there's, really strong concentrations of retailers who've invested in multi-tier programs where it's not just really cheap. It's something that can be very premium, but still at a value offering where consumers have a really strong, I think, choice between what they've always seen within national brands or even in local brands and what they're seeing from the retailer's own brand. And again, complete democratization across the landscape. And I think an undeniable current that enables pretty much everything that we've talked about throughout this first part of the discussion is our access to information, our access to technology, and I think a very direct role that social media platforms have played in helping consumers navigate a lot of this choice. So it's probably no new news to say that people are getting more information from these platforms, but seeing the impact specifically related to their decisions to buy organic, to live healthier, the ways in which they're doing that are very strongly aligned demographically, generationally, and I think behaviorally with activity, I would say, on digital platforms as a whole, because it's kind of hard to define what is social media today and what's a broad digital media landscape. These are the new points of discovery of the next cauliflower rice trend. These are the new points of discovery for saying, you know what, I'm willing to take a bet on this private label, and it's going to deliver all the same attributes and benefits I'm getting from the brand that I've always trusted, but I'm getting it for a little bit cheaper. And I think it's giving consumers the confidence to take that leap. And it's giving companies like Brandless, which is, I don't know if that's a brand or if it's a private label, a really authentic way to get to consumers and say, we're going to give you the clean, organic, natural, different appeals, but it's $3. And that type of appeal, I think, is really resonating with shoppers who still get the trust and the confidence, but they're getting things for less. They're able to do both. They're having their cake and eating it too. So all of the technology, all the information we have at our disposal is helping us really navigate what was ultimately kind of a complex world that was artificially constrained to be packaged food, organic food, natural food. All that is blurring, and all we see now is choice, and we have the ability to navigate some of that choice. So I will leave it here. I'll toss it over to Melissa to go, I think, a little bit deeper into some of the dynamics that we'll see next, and I think probably get into some of the why of why we're seeing some of the things that we're seeing in the data.
Great. Thanks, Jordan, so much. It's so wonderful to be here today, this morning, with everyone. Melissa Abbott with the Hartman Group up in Seattle, Washington area. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit to just sort of start talking about who is the organic consumer. So we think about organics as this one big umbrella. However, the consumer themselves, at the Hartman Group, we spend a lot of time, we do a lot of data like Nielsen, but we do a lot of very deep qualitative work. We have a lot of sociologists and anthropologists on our staff who really get inside consumers' homes, look in their pantries and their cupboards, and peek in their backpacks and things like that to really understand what's going on in this space. So it's interesting because we look at the very evolved or progressive or core organic consumer and how they're kind of pushing what the topic is, what the drivers are. And then we have the periphery consumer who's kind of on the other end, who is much more interested in value and convenience. And recently I was in a consumer's home, and she was a periphery organic consumer. She had a lot of packaged goods, a lot of organic packaged goods. And she recently gained a bit of weight. And she said, I don't understand this because I eat all organic food. And so it was very interesting just to kind of understand, like, from that consumer's journey. She's on this journey, and so even several years, being able to talk to her about what she was doing several years prior, she'd really made this big evolution in terms of how she'd cleaned up her diet. And it was true, she'd gotten rid of a lot of the processed foods, but what they looked like now, they were organic. It was true, and she just couldn't kind of figure out that it was still a lot of maybe calories and that kind of stuff. So just to kind of dive in very deeply in terms of what motivates today's consumer. So what we're finding is over the years is, as we've been talking to consumers for nearly 30 years about this topic in sustainability and health and wellness, what we're finding is that they're becoming so much more mindful, so much more conscious. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that tip of the spear consumer, because that is moving very fast. And as Jordan was talking about how social media is making an impact, it is having such a huge impact on the consumer today that what used to take 10 years to evolve as a trend is now taking about 2 years, sometimes even shorter. So when we talk about biodynamics, regenerative agriculture, the great nutrient collapse, I'll get into that. That's about CO2. Farmers in the room will be able to explain that better than me, but I'll give you the sort of consumer perspective. And farm-driven distinctions. These are all things that consumers are becoming a lot more savvy about being able to talk about, articulate. And so essentially what's happening is that consumers are seeking a lot more information. They're looking for greater degrees of transparency, and they are becoming much more mindful about the food choices that they're making. And they want to really know what's good for their health, what's good for the environment, and what are ethical issues these days in terms of the foods that they're eating. So what we do know is that consumers, how they're making these decisions is very important. They look at all of these different criteria, such as what's in it, how was it made, who made it, was it a nice person, right? And how is it grown? So they look at all these different criteria, and it isn't on every single product. And I don't think that they're literally looking at every one of these things when they pick a product up off the shelf. But they're looking at a couple of these different things in various categories, and they're choosing one to really kind of grab onto. So take, for example, what's in it. They want to know that, like with organic, that it's based on inherent positives, and that there are absence of negatives, things that won't harm them in the long term. It's got to have that short ingredient list. It's got to be recognizable. And then when we think about how was it made, the consumer today is really much more savvier about these preparation methods. Like, well, what happened at the factory where this product was made? Was it huge scale? Was it something that a person didn't really have a lot, but did they press a button and it was on a conveyor belt? And what was the distinction in terms of, was there a culinary distinction in how that product was made? So all these types of things are really conveying to the consumer what a higher quality product is all about. What's healthier for them, what's cleaner as well. And they want to really know, and I said that idea of like, was it made by a nice person? They really want to know that there's someone who has shared values behind the products that they're buying today. They're realistic though. They know that companies make mistakes, and they want to know when there is something that goes wrong that they own up to it. It's okay if things happen, if things go wrong. But gosh, have integrity and own up to it, and they'll be right by your side. They'll continue to stand by you as long as you're saying, okay, we made a mistake, and this is what we're going to do to fix it. And also, how was it grown? What was the soil content like? It's really interesting to hear. Even 5 years ago, we never heard consumers talking about soil unless they were really, really deeply involved. Now today, we're talking about, like, mainstream consumers are saying, like, soil health is important. And grass-fed really sort of tipped that off with, cows being fed on grass and all that kind of thing, and making it much more clear that the soil itself was making better tasting vegetables and produce. And the idea of farm-level distinctions is this, excuse me, let me just go back a second, is this idea of they want to know things like if it's GMO-free. That's great because it gives them a lot more information than just the idea of a fiber call-out on the front of the pack. So while that still might be important in the short term, we're seeing for the long term, consumers really want to know a lot more about these farm-driven distinctions, how a product was made, organic, biodynamic, glyphosate-free, GMO-free. These are the types of things that are cueing that consumer, again, that it's a higher quality product. And so what this means too is that there is a very broad cultural shift happening today. And it's towards consumers who are valuing foods that really tap into nature, essentially. And so this is an idea of growth and accessibility, positive experiences, social reinforcement. And this is where this cultural change has increased food literacy exponentially. And we can also thank food media for that as well, and social media. So, you're at the grocery store, you're at a restaurant, you don't know what something is, Google it, and consumers now, they have this much greater library of what things are and what should and shouldn't be there. And also this idea of food as a moral badge. So it isn't so much that you shouldn't be eating certain things, but it's like, okay, if I'm buying from a company that has really good ethical growing practices, that they treat their employees well, it makes you feel good about carrying that brand around. And this is something that we're hearing a lot of consumers talk about. And it's decreasing barriers. Jordan mentioned this as well with private label, democratization of organic. So there's a lot more widely available products, and it's across much more categories than ever before. And it's really what it's starting to do is it's making that more organic and natural purchases are on the rise, and those trade-ups sometimes can be a little bit stickier because the consumer will say, well, I just bought organic in all of these categories, so maybe if I buy my apples that are local or transitional, they're not necessarily certified organic. That's where they start to make those trade-offs where they feel like they're being a good steward to their family, essentially. So it spans across all of the categories that they're shopping for. And so these increased perceived benefits, it's all about, fewer chemicals. It suggests that, you're going to be safer for the long term. The unknown is why consumers are really reaching for organics and those deeper levels of distinction. And then essentially, it's better for the world. And we do know, too, that organic continues to be a powerful symbol of safer, higher quality, and more ethical food. Now, while some consumers do say they don't feel that confident that organic is enough, they feel like that's all that we have right now in a more democratic fashion to be able to find things that are safe and clean. And that's why we think that biodynamic might be that next thing that's edging on that fringe. So it's a very complex world, food right now. There is no doubt about that. And the organic label is the closest thing that consumers feel is a really good signpost for this safer and better food. And so really what it comes down to is that it's organic to consumers. When we survey them and we go into their homes and talk to them about it, it's grown without pesticides. That's the definition. And then it's made without chemical ingredients, and it's produced with greater care for the world. It's about trust and standards, and it's becoming so much easier to shop. And here are two quotes from one female who has young kids in her house, another one whose kids have left the house, have gone off to college and so forth. And she talks, the one on the left says she talks about buying organic wherever she can, especially for produce, because it tastes different. She really feels like she is getting a higher quality product that tastes better. The nutrition is there, the flavor. And it's not just about safer, it's also about more deliciousness. And there are these triggers that are getting consumers involved in organics and cleaner food today. And it's health and wellness, sustainability, and culinary inspiration. So yes, we're all trying to feel better on a daily basis. When you wake up, you want to feel like you can tackle the day. And consumers are making a greater connection with the foods that they put into their body and how they feel. We really are seeing this across all demographics now, where consumers are making this connection to food. And whether it's weight loss and weight management, first-time pregnancies, we're really seeing that sustainability is also becoming a huge trigger, where it's this connection to impactful issues like animal welfare, climate change, and agricultural impact. All of these things, it used to be that we used to talk to consumers who were much more sustainability-minded and some consumers who were health and wellness-minded. Now the lines are completely blurring. It's so fascinating. Then there's also culinary inspiration. This goes back to that notion of deliciousness and discovery. So we think about how we're all traveling so much more. It's so much more accessible. The world has become so much smaller in so many ways. And even if you're not physically traveling, you're sitting there and you're watching a program on TV that's teaching you about these far-flung places with delicious spices and berry seasonings in Morocco and all kinds of wonderfulness that you can actually incorporate in your own home. Or you can go and eat out. So our palates are changing. We're much more open to discovery. And these triggers, combined with reinforcing social influence, are increasing accessibility with positive experiences with organic, and it's leading to greater adoption. So this looks like a lot of stuff, and it is. But I just want to kind of point out a couple of things. So our anthropologists at the Hartman Group, we like to use language and linguistics a lot to really get to the meat and the heart of how consumers are making these decisions. So when we think about the heuristics of organic, and to some extent natural as well, it's about grown simply. Okay, so it's like you've got the main hubs there that are closer into the organic and natural. So you see grown simply, and we talk about all these, we talk to all these different consumers and say, well, what does that mean to you, grown simply? Well, it's like no chemicals, no GMOs, no pesticides, herbicides. And the more they know about organic, that more evolved, progressive consumer, they're the ones who are saying no glyphosate, no water contamination, the soil's healthier, and there's no monoculture. There's a lot of talk. Consumers are understanding a lot more about permaculture and monoculture these days. And then that idea of trust, as you can see on the bottom. It's this idea of declining standards. That's an issue that consumers feel very strongly about all across the board, regardless of how involved they are with organics. And that's something that we'll hopefully get to talk a little bit more in the larger discussion. Now I'm going to show you 3 different things that we think are a little bit more about this idea of on the cutting edge and going to be out there. So in the next couple of years. So in 1950, 30% of the world's population was urban. In and by 2050, it's going to be 66%. So we have to start making some decisions pretty quickly to figure out how we're going to feed all these people all this wonderful fresh produce and have it be, in the deli sections and also value-added produce as well. So things like vertical farming, hydroponics, and aquaponics are things that we see consumers, these urban consumers, becoming much more readily accepting of. Because the future of sustainability and food production is here, and although urban agriculture is going to be a crucial part of this, feeding this growing and urban population, its viability depends on disruptive technology from the innovators in the farming industry. And then glyphosate. This is something we're hearing a lot of consumers talk about. And it isn't just consumers on the coasts or in the Brooklyns and Portlands and Seattles of the world. It's also, recently I interviewed a consumer who lived about an hour outside of Plano, Texas. And she was talking about glyphosate, and she was a very mainstream person, but she had little kids. And so she was saying, I'm worried about this. My kids have some serious food allergies, and I think that it has something to do with all of the glyphosate that's being sprayed on stuff. So whether that is or not is less the point. It's what the consumer believes. So we are anticipating that glyphosate-free might be one of the next call-outs that consumers are going to be seeking. And rounding off today, this discussion in terms of biodynamics, we see this as an on-the-horizon trend that progressive consumers are absolutely deepening their understanding of the connection between soil quality and flavor of foods and nutrition. So again, it's that deliciousness and nutritiousness that consumers are seeking to kind of, come together. So while we don't see it, in the next couple of years being a huge thing, we think that there's going to be a long, slow burn growth of biodynamics because of that lack of trust and transparency in the current USDA organic label. So thank you so much.
Hi, I'm David Bloom. I own Whiskey Hill Farms, and we're the largest producer of organic turmeric in North America.
Nice.
And we're not very far from here, and talking with other growers in the area, we're seeing consumers apparently looking more for a local label than an organic label. I'm just wondering if that's been a trend noticed by others.
Yeah, I had mentioned that where that's one of the sticky trade-offs that consumers are, as they're starting to put more organics into their cart, they're starting to make trade-offs and things that, they'll look at a product and say, is it part of the dirty dozen? And turmeric's a great example where, they'll say, well, it already seems like it's probably pretty natural. It's not hanging off a tree that spray could get it. So they start to make all of these sort of imagery things in their mind. So yes, local for certain products is going to be even more important to a lot of consumers because they also feel like they're contributing to something nearer into them that's going to contribute to their collective community.
And retailers are also using that as a differentiator to say, we have an entrenched community tie, and this product comes as part of that tie as well. And so consumers look for it. I think the industry looks for it as well. And so there's, I think, a multiplicative effect.
When I watch both your presentations, and especially that chart you used with when you said all that stuff, one of the things that occurred to me is that I wonder how much, yes, consumers are sort of more aware. You talk about glyphosate. And you said, what's more important is the fact that they're concerned about it as opposed to the reality. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that's a problem. Because it seems to me when you say that, and it also ties back to the woman who loads her cabinet up with organics and thinks she's going to lose weight and gains it. I wonder to what degree the problem is that growers, suppliers, and retailers aren't really telling the story as effectively as they need to tell it. That all this stuff is out there, but consumers think they know a lot more than they actually know. And that creates the problem both in terms of all that information and also leads to the problem with democratization that you were talking about, Jordan, in terms of, it's not just produce anymore, it's all that other stuff. The consumers are despite all the information, I wonder if consumers are actually woefully misinformed or underinformed.
That's absolutely true. And at the Hartman Group, we really look at it as, whatever they think of as being the truth is the truth. Mm-hmm. If they think glyphosate is the thing that they need to avoid, just like gluten, every one of our clients, 5 years ago was like, how do we turn everything into gluten-free? And we said, well, okay, we'll help you, but that's not going to be a long-term solution. And right now, and consumers thought gluten-free was the panacea to all of their problems. It turned out not to be the case. And so when that doesn't work, the consumer in America needs to look to something that's next. So I don't think of it so much as a problem as a challenge for those of us in the industry, that we need to be more cautious about how we use call-outs. And that's why I was talking about farm level distinctions in terms of 20 grams of protein. That's awesome, that's great. But once the consumer starts to get more of an understanding about farm level distinctions, we can take them on that journey in a more effective way. But right now, to your point, Kevin, it's true. We're faced with some difficult issues where the consumer really doesn't understand glyphosate and GMOs. So simple messaging is really how we can handle it at this stage.
I think we've got to also have a level of comfort that there's only so much we can control too. So it's incredibly important to control your own messaging. But I mean, we see a small but noticeable blip in sales for organics, naturals every time there's a new documentary released around the concerns that underpin a lot of these appeals. And so the reality is consumers are surrounded by all these messages, and many of them are, I'm not going to say fake news, but it's a lot. No one knows what's real. Forget about politics or food. It's all kind of this environment that we're operating in as people. And I think it's our job collectively to just be simple and clear and specific with the area that you can control and own.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. John Toner with United Fresh Produce Association. I live by a saying, I've never met a depressed tan person. But my question is, in all your research, how important is the sun to the consumer? When you talk about urban growing, hydroponic growing, organic growing, how important is the sun to the consumer?
It's a good question. I don't know that we have any specific research on sun. I mean, I think one of the questions for, I'll lump in, vertical farming with Soylent and everything. I think we've seen consumers get a little bit more comfortable with the idea of lab-like environments being amenable to food in general. So I don't have anything specific on sun, but the more that shoppers are trying some of these things, they become kind of gateway drugs for the overall appeal. I mean, we saw the same thing with almond milk and dairy-free milk alternatives as well, where I do think there's at least an acceptance of a good enough version that opens up the door for those types of appeals as something they're at least willing to try. It's got to deliver on the goods, but all of the work happening around, meat alternatives, dairy alternatives, I think do sort of pave the way for, okay, I'm willing to try produce that was actually grown inside.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question, and one that we hear that a more evolved progressive consumer who says, I don't want to consume hydroponic produce that's grown inside of a truck or with lights. I want the sun. I want it to be able to have the ability to fight off pests and disease so it has more nutrients. That is the consumer who is so evolved, and this is their passion, this is their hobby. The mainstream consumer likes convenience, and if we can deliver a product that is more convenient and is going to provide accessibility, they're going to have fewer questions around that idea of, is it as nutritive as something that was grown in the sun? So it really opens the door to a lot of possibility because it's a smaller percentage of the population who's questioning whether things are grown in soil in a more, with actual sun than in these more technological formats, much like cellular meat, as you were saying, Jordan.
I'm Robert from Mike and Mike's Organics in Canada. The question's for Melissa. Melissa, are you seeing the evolution of the core organic customer when you talk about the values change? Or is this coming from the millennials that are showing up and creating this this new perspective as they look for more information beyond organic?
Yeah, so our segmentation model, 13% of the population is core, but what we see is that, and that's a small number, but they have tremendous influence on that mid-level, the mainstream. And so the mainstream today, when we talk to them about their food values and aspirations, they are so much closer to what the core was talking about 5 years ago. So it's this constant evolution of now the core, what they were talking about 5 years ago, they're so far beyond that. And that periphery consumer with all of the organic and the weight loss thing, now, that consumer is looking more like the mid-level. And it's not just millennials. Of course, millennials have brought us all of this idea of possibility. But let's face it, it was the boomers who brought organics to the fore. All right, they were the pioneers, the renegades, and they were the ones who were like, okay, this is what's better for the planet. But it's the millennials. I don't want to I'm a Gen Xer, so but it's millennials who really said, this is delicious stuff. We need to make this more accessible. This is cool, and it tastes great. Let's So it's everyone and all in between. But the most important thing is what that core is talking about today. That mid-level mainstream, your consumers, they're going to be talking about it in just a couple of years. So that's why we need to pay attention to that kind of far out there stuff.
Hi, Alan Asbury with Bard Valley Day Company. All the data I've looked at shows that the consumers spend about 6 to 8 seconds for making a choice inside the store. And today I see a lot of consumers actually looking at the package in the store more than they did in the past. What data do you have that says that the consumer is spending more time there, or are they researching more, or is it what we're pushing out with our information from our companies?
I mean, we see it both in store. There certainly is more, pack flipping and actually reading ingredient labels if there is one. But there's also more latent upfront research before they even get into the store. And I think things like those food documentaries become part of that research too. So it's not even necessarily a mindful, I'm going to evaluate the choices I have on the shelf in front of me. Things that are part of our entertainment become educational in the sense of informing some of those choices, even without us being in a path to purchase, if you will. So the more educated we are about our food, that is becoming more of a mainstream behavior. And so I think there's latent research happening, even without us necessarily sitting out to research the choices we have.
It's so much more passive, so that when you're not even, consumers today aren't even trying. It's on their Instagram feeds, their Facebook feeds, and they're just kind of scrolling through, and they're picking up stuff so passively that then when they are at the store, they don't even realize. They're like, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to get the thing with that in it. I'm supposed to get this thing. So that's why those 6 to 8 seconds have all of this other information that they didn't even realize that they were acquiring in their heads. So it makes our jobs a lot harder.
Well, that leads naturally into what is going to end up being the final question, because we only have about 6 to 8 seconds left. So what can retailers and suppliers do in a concrete way to create clarity rather than confusion? What should they be doing right now so they can build sales in organic, so they can differentiate organic from all that other stuff, and tell a compelling story that is going to serve as the why, if you will, behind the next buy? What can they do?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see kind of get in the way of that happening is we get so hung up on delineations and labels and kind of structures that have always organized the way that we collaborate or the way that the industry is structured, and we worry about, is this online or is it in store? Where do I invest? What is the reason, what is the value that your product delivers to consumers? And what is the brand doing to instill that? And what are retailers doing to reinstill that directly at the point of sale? And how do you be as consistent and clear throughout that entire journey across both sides of that collaboration?
Yeah, and to build on that, that slide that I had, that how is it made, who made it, it's about figuring out what your narrative is and what is the passion behind the, it's just one little thing. Think about what that is, whether it's the people behind it, the growing methods, the location. You have to go with one thing that is like the most critical, interesting aspect that's going to really, catch consumers, and just tell the narrative from that perspective, because that's going to be the thing that draws them in. You don't need to hit every single one of those points, but you have to choose one of them and really provide the consumer with this sense of this is who we are and this is why you want to put us into your shopping cart.
But is it fair to say, but if you had to choose one, I mean, if it were me, I'm guessing here. If it were me, I'm thinking to myself, I'd want to know more about the farmer than about the soil quality. Because I don't know, what do I know from soil? Dirt's dirt, right, for me.
For you.
I know that's right, but I'll bet you dirt's dirt for a lot more consumers than who know anything about what goes into dirt. So it would seem to me that the best way to connect with consumers in a compelling way is to talk about the farmer. I mean, how much do you want to drill down? Because again, I think the goal is to create clarity, not confusion. And what always worries me about these things is, first of all, I don't see retailers. I've never been in a retailer that has talked about soil quality in the produce department.
Not
ever.
yet.
Not
Not
yet.
yet.
But you think that's going to happen
Yep.
soon?
Yes.
Who's going to do it first?
Taking stock tips.
Well, PCC in the Pacific Northwest is definitely a retailer that I would see pushing that envelope. They're doing some amazingly progressive things. So I'm putting my money on PCC.
There you go.
I think this is where, I've heard people talk about, virtual reality and augmented reality. You could put the farmer right in the aisle with the shopper, tell them the story of how that product came to be, what the soil quality was, what's the story of that product coming to life. That can be in store, that could be online. The technology enables some of that. So I think maybe that's a few years out, but I think that's the kind of information and the personalized information where maybe you get a different story from the farmer from one that you get or one that I get. And I think that ultimately becomes the future.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I think is going to happen is this is one of the places where brick and mortar retailers are going to have a different challenge than e-commerce retailers. Because e-commerce has, in some ways, while they have a less tangible platform on which to tell their story, they also have a broader platform on which to tell their story. And it's going to be interesting. It's a place where I think brick and mortar retailers can differentiate themselves, but that really, really good e-commerce retailers are going to be working to figure out how to turn that into an advantage as well. Which is a great way for me to segue into the fact that the next session in this room is going to be about e-commerce. So we're going to be talking, we've been talking a lot about the present and the short-term future over the last 50 minutes or so, but we're going to be looking at the future a little bit further out in the next session. So join me in thanking Melissa and Jordan for their time this morning.
Thank you.
If you're like me, you wish we had another hour to do this, because this is, to me, is fascinating. Thank you very much. I think they're serving coffee out there. You got 10 minutes to get to your next session, or you can just sit here and wait for ours. So thanks very much, everybody.